before we talk before we talk about those specific opportunities for contamination of water, there's an access issue that we really need to think about. Our country is huge, and there are so many unique circumstances that drive whether or not we have enough water and how whether or not it's safe. As you can see from this map, the central states and western states um, have a high water stress index. In other words, the red and darker reddish brown areas are coloring the geographies where they don't have enough water. They basically are in a very water stressed circumstance and just don't have enough. And that poses some of its own challenges. Another important feature of our drinking water landscape is that not all of our water is regulated. What is regulated is only the water that comes from some sort of municipal or regional um, drinking water facility. And that would be possibly surface water or groundwater. But there are 42 million people who have their own wells in their homes. And everyone with a well in their home um, does not have that well tested except if they do it themselves. So no government agency is regulating it. No one is testing it. Sometimes someone in your neighborhood may test their well and find there's a problem and let you know, but actually no one's testing yours unless you do it. And that's a lot of people. And as you can see from this map, the areas that have the darker colors have a higher percentage of people who have their own household wells and do not use municipal water. We use water for so many things. It's essential for our health in terms of drinking enough water, for bathing, recreation, but also for energy and for irrigation and so many other sources. Which is why when we didn't really protect it in any way, we saw our surface water and didn't see it but knew it was happening, our groundwater become contaminated. This is a series of pictures taken before the EPA was in existence. And you see the trash in our waterways, the raw sewage that made our rivers stink and be brown because raw sewage was dumped in there every day. Chemical contamination. You see this oil slick around the Statue of Liberty in New York. These are scenes that now we rarely see, thanks to some regulation and vigilance, but it's not the end of the story. In 1970, I'll just remind you, it was a Republican president that signed the National Environmental Policy Act into law, and that was Richard Nixon. And we don't want to overstate that he was a tremendous environmentalist, but he recognized what these terrible things that were happening around the country in our air, our water, and the toxic substances that were being dumped everywhere without being regulated in any kind of a robust way. And so the EPA was the best outgrowth, I think, of the National Environmental Policy Act. And the EPA was charged with reining in all of this pollution and dealing with previous contamination. And so this whole host of regulations came from the EPA in the 1970s. And today we're really going to focus on the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, both of the early part of the 70s. So the key policy initiatives that I think came from the Clean Water Act was that every body of water in the United States had to develop a water quality standard. So in other words, what were you going to be using that lake for? Is it drinking water? Is it just recreation? Are you fishing there? What is it used for? And based on its use, these water quality standards were established. There was a permit required for any kind of discharge of pollutants into waters of the United States. And often that was point source. So discharge meaning from a discharge pipe into one of those bodies of water. To take care of all that sewage, raw sewage that was being dumped into our waterways, our wastewater treatment plants. Well, we had them before then, but they weren't really regulated. But they were now going to be regulated according to best available technology. But I will say that best available technology was focused on removing the microbiological contamination that, rather than a lot of chemical contamination, although it did remove some. And permits were required to do any discharge any sediments or fill in any wetlands. We suddenly realized, not suddenly, but over time realized that wetlands were not just sort of junk land that we couldn't do much with. They were actually critically important ecosystems that we relied on for many things. And so here are some examples of those point sources that were regulated really quite well by the Clean Water Act. The permits said how much and what and where emissions could be, could go from these pipes into waters of the United States. But we have some ongoing challenges to clean water. Non-point sources, in other words, those sources that are don't come out of a pipe, that are more geography based, and also combined sewer overflow that we'll talk about in a minute. So here's an example of a non-point source, agriculture, where we have agrochemicals flowing into ditches that end up flowing into streams, creeks, and other waterways, rivers. We have large animal operations, those kinds of operations where they have thousands of animals in one place. And what do animals do? They poop. And so their poop is now finding its way into lots of waterways. And all kinds of beautiful lawns, golf courses, these kinds of large expanses that in order to get a lawn looking this way, you need a lot of chemicals to do it. And those chemicals then wash off with every rain into the nearest body of water. And all of our streets have stormwater drains, and that's the oils, the gasoline, and other chemicals wash from the streets into these stormwater drains and then to our wastewater plants. And none of these are addressed by the Clean Water Act. So let's talk about combined sewer overflow. When you have dry weather, as pictured on the leftmost diagram, we have storm drainage from streets, and we have household waste drainage from our homes going into the same sewer system. It's not a lot of drainage, and so it is easy for our wastewater treatment plants to accommodate it. And so all of that in dry weather goes to our wastewater treatment plants. But as soon as we get even more than an inch of water in most of our cities, we see that volume is now too much for our wastewater treatment plants. And so what happens? That combined raw sewage and water from streets ends up, some of it goes for treatment to the plant, but everything that would be overflow goes out into our streams and rivers. And I'm going to use Philadelphia as an example because I'm most familiar with it. We have combined sewer overflow. And what you're looking at on this map, each of those boxes, regardless of color, represents one of the 164 places along Philadelphia rivers and streams where this combined sewer overflow occurs when we have rain. So this happens to be a day in February where there was no rain in the preceding 72 hours, but there was snow. And it didn't last for long, just a light dusting of snow, and just that was enough water to cause this combined sewer outfall. And so the orange color boxes mean that overflow is happening in the past 72 hours. The black ones mean that there was no overflow there. So you see, in all three of the major waterways, we had significant overflow just with the dusting of snow. The EPA does not currently post a map that gives all of the locations, at least not one that I could find. So this one is old, at least 10 years old, and it shows with all those black dots all of the places that had combined sewer overflow at that time. The EPA has been working with cities to try to eliminate this. Some cities, the EPA is required to actually split their household sewage from street overflow, street water, sewage systems, and some they've just done a variety of other techniques. But Philadelphia still has quite a lot of overflow, as I'm sure some of these other places do too. And now imagine that combined sewer overflow system in the face of climate change. So if we have downpours and huge amounts of water coming, in shorter periods of time, we will have much more outflow, combined sewer outflow in those various places throughout the country where water is going to be an issue. But in addition to that outflow into our rivers, we just have flooding. I mean, there is flooding in a lot of places in the country, and flooding means that you have picking up of contamination from places where it normally wouldn't run into waterways, and now it is. And so there's lots of contamination in floodwaters. Here's an example from Philadelphia in 2021. You're looking at the main highway called the Vine Street Expressway in the middle of Philadelphia. It was completely underwater. And yes, what you're seeing, those signs, those are on an overpass. And so that's the kind of flooding we had. So in that floodwater, not only was it loaded with street kinds of debris, but it flooded the adjacent areas that are partly industrial, partly residential, partly commercial. And so all of that mixed together in this kind of flooding event. And that was minor in terms of contamination, I believe, compared to what happens in Houston. So the top two pictures are after Hurricane Harvey inundated 13 hazardous waste sites around Houston in 2017. There is a lot of spillage at a lot of industrial places. There's a lot of, when water rushes through as a force, it can break through protections around tanks. Tanks themselves can be broken open. So there's a lot of reason why we are likely to see hazardous waste sites. And we have a lot of other industry very adjacent to places that flood. And so there's a lot of opportunity for this throughout the country. But it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be just cars. If there are some geographies across the country where flooding occurs not just when we have a lot of rain, but maybe when we have a lot of rain upstream and the downstream communities end up getting massive amounts of water that inundate them. And so here's an example. This is a neighborhood in Philadelphia called Eastwick where that happens. And all of the cars that were there because people didn't have a warning to get out are now adding to this flood water. Oil, gasoline, radiator fluids, heavy metals. And so these, as the water recedes, it goes back into what is, in some cases, drinking water, source water. So now let's think about how do we regulate and keep that water safe. So the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974 applies to public water systems in the U.S. So all of the water systems that are managed by a public water authority. Those are all EPA enforced regulations. And so the EPA did set national standards based on good science, and but it also considers available technology and cost. So as a citizen, we might say, I don't want anything in my water. I want it to be perfect. I want it to be pristine. I want it to be free of all contaminants. Well, that is not the way our current EPA or any EPA ever set standards. They did consider cost, and when it was cost prohibitive to remove all of a certain contaminant, they set a standard for that. They set a standard saying how much can be in that water and have it meet safety standards. These standards are called maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. And initially, the Safe Drinking Water Act focused on the treatment of water by disinfection, basically trying to get rid of those bacteria and hard to get rid of bacteria, and didn't think too much about a lot of the other contaminants. But about 100 chemicals are regulated. Congress said that EPA could not continue to add to that list. There had to be this fixed number that they could require be evaluated by these municipal authorities. And anything more than that, they had to take some chemicals off the list to add new ones. And so that's what's being done. 10% of public water systems remain out of compliance with the MCLs, and the most common chemical that is out of compliance are the ones that are the remnants or the breakdown products of the chlorination of water. So, chlorine is spectacular at eliminating many microbes, microbiologicals, but if there are times when you have to you add a lot of chlorine, there may be more breakdown products, and those breakdown products, some of them can increase the risk for cancer. And so, if you ask me, is it better to not die of microbiological disease and maybe have a couple of cancers caused in the country? I'm gonna vote for chlorine every time, but I do think that we do need to monitor that to make sure that we're talking about a very low risk and not something that is growing. Periodically, the EPA asks these regulated water systems to test a new group of chemicals, about 20 or 30. And that's how they determine what new maximum contaminant levels we need. They look around the country. There's a number of other people doing some sort of water testing, and they get ideas about what they think could be a problem, and that's how they figure it out. But again, private well owners are not required to test their water. So this is an example, a couple of iterations ago of a list of 30 contaminants that were required to be tested. And at this time, you'll see there are some PFAS on here, PFOS, PFOA. We're going to talk a little bit more about those. And this is when the EPA was just figuring out maybe we should be regulating this group of chemicals. And but really why I wanted to show this list is there are some known human carcinogens on here. So when I first saw this, I thought, wow, you mean we aren't always looking for known human carcinogens? Because there aren't that many known human carcinogens. But no, the answer is no. We aren't testing for known human carcinogens in everyone in our water. And here's an example. Chrome 6 and 1,3-butadiene are two known human carcinogens that we, I guess, aren't always testing for. And then the blue stars represent those that are probable human carcinogens. The most recent iteration of this, sort of request by EPA to water systems really focused on the PFAS chemicals. You'll see the vast majority on this list are PFAS. And let me just show here. These are all the PFAS chemicals, and they have long names, but there are many of them, and it's important that we figure out just how much is in our drinking water, because the science is showing that, in fact, they are health impactful. So far, the Environmental Working Group has been tracking where PFAS contamination is in the United States, and all of the light blue circles represent those areas in drinking water. The purple are the sites on military bases, and orange represent other sites where it's been used and contaminated the ground and groundwater. So where did this come from? Well, when it was developed as firefighting foam to start with, and that firefighting foam has been used at every airport, every military establishment, and a lot of other places throughout the country. In fact, there are pictures of firefighters spraying firefighting foam on uh, sort of a large area of grass for children to play in at fairs, at sort of county fairs. And so it was initially, although not tested, it was initially thought to not be toxic, and so it was used in a way that really didn't protect anyone or protect the environment, and so it is everywhere. And in addition to its use in firefighting foams, it's used in a lot of things that are waterproof items. So our boots, our jackets, some waterproof clothing, flooring, paints, and even in a lot of food containers. The inside of a pizza box you might see as being a little shiny. That's probably PFAS. And so now that we have it in so many of our items, personal care items, things that we use every day, our landfills are loaded with it. And so the landfills are now leaching out into other areas, these chemicals. So this is really a problem everywhere. So one of my greatest concerns is not only is it in water, but because it's in water, freshwater fish are contaminated. And this study that was done in 2023 was fairly startling to me and others. And it basically measured PFAS in fish throughout the country and found that one fish serving can be equivalent of drinking water for a month at 48 parts per trillion. And 48 parts per trillion is incredibly high and higher than any drinking water standard. So when they compared what someone's blood, or they modeled what someone's blood level might be after eating just four meals a year of PFAS contaminated fish from fresh water, they found that PFAS levels in the blood would double. And when they compared it to the National Health and Nutrition Exam study, this is a study that's been ongoing since 1999, where they annually test 5,000 adults and children. And what they do is they test them and ask them a million questions. They test them for all kinds of things, not just PFAS, but fortunately PFAS was there. And what they've found is that, yes, the PFAS levels have gone down significantly over time. But what is interesting is now the PFAS is still around in the environment, and some people are more heavily exposed still than others. People with those drinking wells that haven't tested their wells in some cases. People who eat a lot of local fish. Imagine people doing subsistence fishing. If you are um, living in a place where you have a lot of streams and lakes and you can catch fish there, people do that often. You know, maybe that is their only protein source, and so they're consuming not for fish caught in fresh water, they're actually eating that every day. So you can imagine how there may be a very wide um, 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 distribution of exposure in people across the country. And why do we care? Well, there have been a number of health effects that have been associated with PFAS exposure. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry has identified increased cholesterol, decreased birth weight, um, decreased antibody response, kidney cancer, um, pregnancy-induced hypertension, sometimes called preeclampsia, and changes in liver enzymes as things that are clearly associated with elevated levels of PFAS. Now, that doesn't mean that PFAS causes these things. It just is suggestive. There are likely, there may be that people have to have a certain genetics in order for this to happen. There may be that other things have to be in place for these things to happen. But there has been very clear associations made, if not causation. So the EPA finally came out with drinking water standards for PFAS. Not all of them, because there are thousands, but for the ones that they feel are best studied, and so their standards could actually stand up in court, because remember, anytime the EPA creates any regulation, the first thing that happens is they're challenged in court. Sometimes because the regulation is not strict enough, and sometimes because some people think it's too strict. But they established maximum contaminant levels in 2024 for these PFAS. But in May 2025, the EPA announced that it planned to rescind the MCLs for PFHS, PFNA, and Gen X, and also extend the compliance deadline for PFOA and PFOS from this year to 2031. So there will be water systems that will continue to have PFAS in them until 2031, because there are some water systems that will that are, shall we say, in places where the public is less demanding, that changes happen. I will say that there was a very engaged public north of Philadelphia in an area where their water supply was contaminated by DOD and Department of some research areas from the Department of Justice, not Justice, no, Department of Defense, and they managed to get the water purveyor to actually clean it up before the regulations. So they've always, in the last 10 years, this has happened. So they've had clean water now for about 5 years. But not every community can mount that kind of response and advocacy. So now let's turn from PFAS to microplastics. Microplastics are really the next ubiquitous problem for health. And that's, I think, health of our ecosystems and health for people and animals. Microplastics are, they leach chemicals themselves. They break into tiny particles that are problematic because of their very existence in cells. They also allow other bad things to hitch a ride on them. They create this biofilm for microbiologicals to grab onto that wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity to be there. And then they also absorb chemicals themselves, chemicals that they find in water. And so there's lots of ways they can create hazard. You've heard about the microplastics that are found in fish. Certainly things are being leaching out of those microplastics into the fish itself. They're the sources of the microplastics are many. They're from plastic bags that find their way into waterways, bottle caps, single-use utensils, fishing line. Some of our clothing is really uh, a version of plastic that breaks apart in our washing machines and in landfills. Paints and auto parts, the covering on laundry detergent and dishwasher detergent pods, um, and then all of the plastics that are single use, like those water bottles and uh, the other plastics that our food comes in. They break down in the environment, leading to these microplastics. Um, and they cycle through the environment. Our current drinking water and wastewater plants do not remove microplastics that are less than 10 to 20 micrometers. And even though we may be taking out some of the larger ones, the little ones are still there. And so they're in every glass of water we drink and every water bottle that you purchase, or soda for that matter. Sludge from wastewater, these wastewater plants, is contaminated with microplastics and goes to landfills. And so our landfills are loaded with microplastics. So how do we protect ourselves? Well, filtration at the tap can happen from reverse osmosis, and also through carbon filtration, as long as it meets the NSF ANSI 401 standard, for with very small pores, that can actually capture and discard these microplastics. So I want to talk a little bit about organic chemicals in drinking water. And although a lot of what we just talked about had to do with surface water, this study done by the USGS, it was on groundwater. So wells, not the kind of individual wells that are not being tested, but the public supply wells that are being tested. They test them differently, not looking for standards per se, but they sampled over 900 public drinking water wells that represented 30 aquifers. The aquifers are those big lakes of groundwater that we talked about underground. They tested them for inorganic, which are like naturally occurring radiologicals like radium and uranium, things like that, and also organic, the man-made chemicals that we have gotten there because of us. And so what they found is 1 in 5 of the source water samples had concentrations greater than either MCLs that EPA already had, or health-based standards that were established based on toxicology studies. And so that was concerning. But, the source water is supposed to go through a treatment plant. So doesn't that take it out? Well, unfortunately, when we look at the organic contaminants, no, the answer was no. The current state of drinking water treatment plants did not remove the organics. So as we know, our source water is becoming more and more contaminated with more of these organic chemicals. Our current infrastructure is not set up to remove them. This is, I think, the biggest issue with infrastructure that we have in the United States. And I think that whenever I hear about an infrastructure bill, this is what comes to mind. But unfortunately, that is not where money usually gets spent. It usually gets spent on highways and bridges. And, bridges are important. We do not want to be on a bridge when it falls down or have anyone else there. But this is also important and really is very neglected. And we'll get to that infrastructure funding in just a minute. But I can't talk about water without talking a little bit about lead. So lead doesn't come from our source water. Lead comes from piping. It comes from solder. It comes from fixtures in our homes. And so as you look at this image of this house, there's the water main in the street. And many of those have been replaced and are no longer lead containing. What is often lead containing, though, is the pipe that goes from the water main into the home. And all of that is often either lead or has lead solder. Both are a problem. Um, if you look at the picture, that is really what a lead pipe looks like at the bottom right corner. That lead pipe is silvery, it's irregular. Um, you can tell it's lead and not galvanized steel if you just take a refrigerator magnet and put it on there. And just for your information at your pipe at home, if you find where the water pipe is coming into your home and scratch it a little bit with a coin, if it's gold, it's you know what's it called, brass or not lead or galvanized. If it's silver, on the other hand, um, it can be galvanized steel or lead, and that's where your refrigerator magnet comes in. If it's magnetic, it's galvanized steel. So you want it to be, for a lead pipe, you want it to be silver and not magnetic. And so that's an easy test that anyone can do. And so one of the things people can do if they do have a lead service line is they can run their water. But you have to run it a different amount of time because this diagram, we're looking from above here at a bunch of homes. The yellow box is where the water main would be in the street. And those red lines are how far the faucet inside those homes are from that water main. And so if you are living in a home where it's very short, maybe you need to run your water about 2 minutes. On the other hand, if you're living in this one that is very far in, have a very long distance, you need to run your water for a minute for every 50 feet that your water line is from your faucet in order to get out all of the lead that would have accumulated in your pipes overnight. We'll talk more about that in a second. But I just wanted to clarify, I don't like to spend too much time on lead in water without clarifying that for most children, the single most important source of blood lead elevations is dust in homes. And water is often considered a close second, but is not nearly as important as dust in homes. But we still should replace these lead service lines. And so if you can't afford to do that because that is really expensive and someone's not offering to do it for you, you at least want to have a filter on the water that you drink. And so that is a filter that is NSF ANSI 53. That's the standard. You want it certified under that standard. And that standard works for one that you might put on your tap, a pitcher in your refrigerator, or even the filters sometimes now that are going in refrigerators. They sometimes will also be certified for lead. So as long as that filter is replaced according to manufacturer recommendations, that water should be fine. The other thing, if some people can't afford that, run the water from the tap for 1 minute for every 50 feet that the faucet is from the middle of the street whenever the water's not in use. So that's whenever you go to work, whenever you wake up in the morning, or even if you're just away for a number of hours during the day, you want to do that running before you actually are going to use that water for eating or drinking, for cooking. So there was this lead and copper rule improvements legislation that came under the Biden administration. It said that the majority of water systems will be required to replace lead service lines within 10 years. That's great. But first, it required them to figure out where are all those lead service lines, because basically, most of the time they didn't know. People sometimes knew from inside their house, but the water authorities didn't necessarily know. They also lowered the lead action level to 10 micrograms per liter. It had been 15, and required public notification for any exceedances. Shockingly, the prior standard didn't require public notification. It just required the municipal water authority to actually deal with their corrosion control. Because remember, the water itself doesn't have the lead in it. It's the water passing into and through the pipes where it picks up the lead. And if there's appropriate corrosion control, it shouldn't be able to pick up a lot of lead. Now, water systems have challenged this rule, and shockingly, the Trump administration says it will defend that rule. And so this is the only positive environmental stance that I'm aware of that the Trump administration has taken, but I'm very glad for it. Let's look a little bit at water infrastructure, its status and funding. Well, I think through what we've just talked about, we've established that drinking water treatment plants do not adequately remove emerging contaminants in ground or surface water. And so that is a really critical need for infrastructure updates of those drinking water treatment plants. But most of the infrastructure is actually beyond the plants and in the pipes. We've got 2.2 million of pipes that deliver that drinking water to us. 6.1 million of the individual pipes are lead service lines, according to the American Water Works Association. Just an estimate because they don't know for sure. But many of those pipes and many other ones that may not be lead come from the early part of the 20th century. And recognizing that pipes only have a lifespan of 75 to 100 years, they're breaking right and left. And so there is a lot of infrastructure repair that needs to happen there. We have 240,000 water main breaks every year, resulting in tremendous amounts of water loss and also water contamination as those water pressure changes in those pipes, and they can suck in some of the local flora and fauna. That was odd. The U.S. Water infrastructure has a tremendous gap in funding. The American Society for Civil Engineers found an $81 billion annual gap, not accumulated, but annual gap in between what is spent and what is needed in order to bring our infrastructure up to date. Let me see, having trouble advancing the slide. Not sure why that is. Okay, do it that way. The Congressional Budget Office did a study this year and found that since the 1950s, states have contributed the most of the money to this wastewater infrastructure funding, and that, for example, in 2023, states paid 92% and the federal government only paid 8%. So there's this rhetoric out there that talks about how the federal government is doing all this, work. Well, it's really been the states that have been doing this, and as states have budget problems, it's harder and harder for them to actually do it. And so municipal authorities have been passing a lot of the cost on to households. And between 1998 and 2024, the household payments for water and sewer increased by 2 times the rate of the consumer price index. And here's a map of showing in the darkest colors the highest rates of percentage of households with unaffordable bills. And so, as you can see, it does affect counties throughout the country, but not evenly. There are places where it's worse. So the EPA reported to Congress in 2022 that as many as 19 million U.S. households lacked affordable access to water. And they recommended a number of things: establish a permanent federal water assistance program similar to SNAP, the food assistance program, amend the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to receive appropriations in proportion to their infrastructure need or population. And so right now it's not done under that kind of a appropriation. It's I'm not an expert on that, but basically it's done differently. Require directed community project funding to include a percentage of projects to reduce costs for low-income families. So there are now individual funding projects that Congress, the federal government will support. Usually it's been when there's been something catastrophic that's happened. And that's great that they do that, but they don't necessarily require the funds to help lower costs for people who need lowering of costs. And that's a strategy they can do it. Similar to the Biden Justice 40 initiative that required 40% of government funding to be allocated to low-income and environmental justice communities. So in summary, wastewater and drinking water infrastructure need improvements across the U.S. to maintain public health. Current environmental regulation is informed by environmental science, but it's not adequately protective of health. And there are emerging threats to health and drinking water that would benefit from engagement with legislators and regulators. And I'd just like to invite you to follow us on Facebook and X, and we may have some other interesting environmental health and environmental issues that you may find, resources that you may find helpful. I will stop sharing and be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Any questions here in the audience?
So I was just struck as I was going into the airport. A lot of our airports now have those water, automatic water units where you get your water bottle like filled up. Do those scan for microplastics at all? Do you know? Is that are those healthy water units that are so
as far as I know, there is no regulation or legislation around microplastics anywhere at all. So this is something that I mean, the only thing, there are the certified control technologies that can be used in a water treatment plant, and there are certifications for in-home filtration, but there's no regulation of microplastics as of yet. So those water refilling stations are probably the same as hearing tap at home, nothing different.
yeah.
We have one from Rick over here, and Tom.
Are particularly thinking of the people with home wells. Is water testing subsidized by any jurisdiction, or is that all a cost that is borne by the homeowner?
That is a great question. There are some states that I believe when you sell your home, they require the seller to get a water test and pay for it. That's few and far between. It might be just a few states. When there is known contamination in the area, so for example, in that place in Pennsylvania I was talking about, where there was the contamination in that Warminster region in north of Philadelphia, the responsible parties were required to pay for home water testing, and then the health department also stepped in and they paid to have some water tested. But now, for instance, the study is over, and people who didn't take advantage of it when it was in place, now they're on their own to get that tested. So I think we do not have a good system right now, and what I think people should do before they buy a house, and actually with some regularity thereafter, depending on what the risks are, should test their water, in particular in places where there's hydraulic fracturing. People who had perfectly good water then later may not, and so it would be worth doing not just a small panel of water testing, a large panel of the kinds of chemicals that could be in hydraulic fracturing fluids, just as a baseline, because how else do you prove that in fact your water's been contaminated if you don't prove at first what the baseline was? I personally think that should be a requirement within a certain geography around hydraulic fracturing, that the company doing the hydraulic fracturing pays for that in the beginning, and then if people have concerns later, they pay for it again. But I haven't seen that happen.
Yeah, we have another question in the room from Tom, and then we'll go to two on the chat.
One of the questions deals with what's in my filter. And that you really don't know based on any labeling on a water bottle station what filters are put in. If they're put in according to the Food and Drug Regulation standards, about 50% of the filters will be, you remove about half the contaminants. If they have a modern PFAS filter installed, coupled with a pre-filter, you have a good chance of having meeting the federal standards. So it really depends on all that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understood everything that you said, but I believe that, you know, the regulations for water that you might get in the airport would be just drinking water regulations. There's nothing special. And if you want to adhere to a higher standard and use a filter at home, that you probably will not be finding that in the airport, because they're just adhering to regular their municipal water sources, just adhering to the federal government's requirements.
Yeah, we have two questions online. Ginger asked, is bottled water regulated the same as community supplies?
Yeah, the water in your bottle is, there's no special regulation for that. And, you know, you might say, well, gee, it's probably filtered a little better because it's if you want someone to buy your water, you want it to have no taste. You don't want there to be any kind of, you know, bad taste. And so that may be true, but taste is not a very sensitive, way to test water as to what's in it. So I would say, and I will say that I'm concerned about bottled water from the leaching of the plastic from the bottle itself, because I once saw a study. They were trying to figure out how to bring clean water to a place that had contaminated water in Africa. And what they did is they took bottles, empty bottles from the United States, and they filled them with clean water. And then they filled them with the dirty water. And they were talking about microbiologicals. They wanted to get rid of bacteria. So they filled them with the dirty water, and then they put them on the aluminum roofs and let them get really hot. And what they found is, yes, they killed the bacteria, but the chemicals that were in that water when they finished with that process were incredibly high. The chemicals that leached out of the plastic were incredible. Now think about the United States and hot warehouses. Where has your water bottle been before it ended up in your store? I'm guessing a lot of them passed through some and sat around in some hot warehouses. So I view them as a significant chemical risk, and I personally try never to drink out of a purchased water bottle when if it's the only thing. I mean, I went on a mission trip to Ghana, and frankly, that's all we could drink, so I did it. But perhaps the alternative would have been worse.
Yeah, that's good. Judy asked, can you explain to the non-scientists what a PPT equals?
Oh, I'm sorry, parts per trillion. That just means that it is an incredibly small number. Most of the MCLs, the maximum contaminant levels, are in parts per billion. And we think, that's a small amount, like 1 part of the thing to a billion parts of water, let's say. So, a part per trillion. I've heard people say that's like um, a microscopic drop of water in an Olympic swimming pool, only maybe even bigger than that. So it is such a tiny amount that it's of concern because if we're needing to regulate it at that level, it's quite toxic. Otherwise, we'd let a lot more of it in there.
Marilyn, a question that I have is on some bottled water, and conversely, if you use something like a soda stream, the bottles that they use for that, they'll actually have expiration dates on it. Do you have any idea what those expiration dates relate to? Are they actually useful?
Well, it's useful to the company because when you throw it out after its expiration date, then you're going to go buy new ones. It has nothing to do with the water.
Yeah, that was my guess as well. Rick.
When we're down in Central America, downstream from mines, there's really high levels of heavy metals, particularly when the water flows through the breached strata. Is there any extra testing, or is there a need for extra testing in the U.S. when you are in areas that have a lot of mining in the area?
Yeah.
The AI.
The heavy metals that are contained in mine drainage are ones, or at least some of them, are on the required testing for the water authority. So I think if you're getting municipal water, it's probably okay because they're probably accounting for that and filtering it out. Well water is a completely different matter, and I think that mine drainage is very hard to figure out because water traveling underground you can get your aquifer contaminated by something a mile away. So I think it's hard to know. I would say if you live in an area where you think that may be an issue, probably want to be getting well water tested maybe every other year, something and it may not be so costly because there may be a marker heavy metal that you don't have to test every single one to know whether or not the mine drainage is getting into your water. You could test one of the more prominent ones, and if that's negative, then it's not likely the other ones are there either.
Thank you.
Joe made a comment here in the room about AI, and this is an interesting question. Now, we know that with fracking water, the produced water has a lot of contaminants. We know it has a lot of contaminants. We have no idea what it is because they're usually proprietary chemicals. What about the data centers? Is the produced water from cooling towers problematic?
I am not aware that they add a lot in terms of chemicals to cooling water for that kind of purpose because in fracking they have to put in lubricants and antibacterials and all these things that because of the drilling aspect of what they're doing. Here we're talking about cooling equipment. So it may be that if they're reusing I'm not sure to the extent it can be reused either. If they're reusing the water, there's probably some antimicrobials in there. But I would think that it's a lot less contaminated. But I don't know to the extent of sort of what they may put in there. Good question.
Great, thanks. And Fred has a question.
Are there any microplastic hazards associated with these Nalgene water bottles that hikers are traditionally using?
Well, anything made of plastic degrades microplastics, right? As it degrades, little pieces come off. So, you know, I think that that's really true for every type of plastic. So I would say that none of it's completely safe. As a society, I think it's very difficult right now to figure out how to make a large impact in the millions of places where we have and use plastics. I mean, they are so integral to everything we do. You know, I spend the extra time in the grocery store and you know, picking out my apples, not putting them in a bag, and then putting them on the thing, and then taking it, you know, and having it and not using the plastic bag. But there are certain things that I buy that only come in plastic. And you know, I think we've all had that experience. It's very disconcerting. I would very much like to not buy things in plastic, but it's not possible. And then the clothing, you know, it's hard. I mean, some people are doing it. Some people are only buying cotton clothing, and I applaud them. I haven't been able to do that personally.
It makes the line from The Graduate very ominous. Plastics, plastics, isn't that the line?
Yeah. That's a good point about the hiking bottles. I know that Nalgene a while back switched their bottles. Of course, a lot of them were made with BPA-free materials to begin with, so all they had to do was change to putting a BPA-free stamp on them. But other bottles did have BPA; they had to change, and of course, they're
Am I frozen or are you frozen?
concerned.
You froze for me for a moment. I didn't hear your question. I think you were talking about there were some water bottles that had BPA. I will tell you, that is also a lot of hype. Whatever they replaced it with hasn't been tested yet. So if it has the same properties, there's no reason to think it's safe. You know, sure, you can go with BPA free, but you know, don't get too excited about it.
Well, the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is many companies make, when you say, well, I'm not going to go with a plastic bottle, I'm going to go with a metal bottle. And a lot of metal bottles are sold with plastic linings inside of them.
Really interesting.
Can't
Well,
that
that would be that could be a labeling requirement ultimately. I'd love to know, you know, have people be informed of that so that they know one way or the other.
Yeah, Joe was pointing out inside vegetable cans. That's been common for years, is the plastic lining inside the vegetable cans.
Plastic and you know, and a lot of other things. There's PFAS was in there. You know, food packaging. I will say I am opposed to most of the new Robert RFK's initiatives in health, but he is not wrong to point out the inadequate regulation of our food packaging. That is an area that I've been concerned about and talking about for a long time, and we just grandfathered in all these chemicals, and we've been using it for years, we'll just keep using it. Well, you know, 40% of the population gets cancer. Why is that? Do you think maybe there's some things we should take a better look at? I do. And I think food packaging is one of them. I don't know if anyone else in the room is as old as I am, but if you are, you remember when toothpaste tubes used to roll up and stay rolled. And why is that? Because they used to be lined with lead. Yeah. So, you know, lead was something we did know about, and so they required it to be taken out. But, you know, when they took the formaldehyde out of Coke, we didn't like the taste. So they put it back in.
And don't forget some of those really fine wines you have laying down in your cellar, those wrappers around the neck are lead.
They are.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. Hit a nerve on that one. Marilyn, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful discussion, so informative.
Great. Well, I enjoyed it and thank you. Thank you. And I'm happy to talk another time on another topic if you're interested. So,
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
bye-bye.
You have a wonderful day.
You too.
Everything.